There are so many options out there to upscale your retro game consoles in order to make them look better on modern TVs. You can use something like a FrameMeister, RetroTink, or an OSSC, and the results can be stunning. The thing that all of these upscalers have in common though is that they're aimed at consoles that don't already have HDMI video output. This leaves a bit of a gap in the market considering that systems like the PS3, Xbox 360, and even the Nintendo Switch are starting to show their age and could benefit from the same type of upscaling we're seeing with those retro systems. This is where the mClassic comes in, created by a company called Marseille and kindly sent to us for the purposes of review. This is an upscaler which converts a HDMI signal and, at least according to the box, adds a depth of field effect, anti-aliasing, sharpens the image, and of course upscales the resolution of whatever console you're using. On top of all of this, it adds no noticeable lag, which in theory makes it the ultimate device for improving your experience with these slightly older systems. You're getting all of this in a device that is barely bigger than a USB stick, and it costs approximately £100 in the UK or $100 in the US, which might seem a little bit expensive, but if it improves the quality coming from your consoles as much as it makes out on the box, then it could be a game changer. Before we dive into the mClassic and everything it's capable of, I want to take a second to mention that our premium coffee table book, A Handheld History, is now available to buy on Amazon. Definitely check it out if you're a fan of portable gaming, a link to it will be in the description below. The mClassic plugs straight into the HDMI port of whatever console you're using, then has you plug a standard HDMI cable into the other end in order to send the video to your display. It does need to be powered by a micro USB cable, which is included with the product, but after setting everything up, it just works. There's no tinkering with menus or complex settings to navigate, it's all pretty straightforward. One minor thing to look out for is that because the device is quite wide, you can't plug it into the switch dock directly because this bit of plastic makes it slightly too wide to fit comfortably. Luckily the mClassic comes with this little HDMI extension, which I assume has been provided for this exact purpose, so this really isn't an issue at all. The only other thing you might want to mess around with is the switch on the side of the device, which has 3 different positions. The first option is simply deactivating the upscaler completely and using it as a pass-through, effectively using your console's video output as it was intended with none of the features of the mClassic. The second option turns on a green light, and this is called the processing on mode. This is basically the default setting you're going to want to use in most cases, with it turning on the upscaling and additional features to improve the image coming from your console. Then the third and final option is the retro mode, turning on a blue light on the device, and as far as I can tell this is exactly the same as the processing on mode, but forces the image to be a 4:3 aspect ratio, which is handy if you're using this with a retro console and your TV doesn't have the option to natively display 4:3. And that's pretty much all there is to it. It's an extremely simple setup process, and once it's plugged in, turned on, and in its default processing mode, you theoretically wouldn't need to touch it ever again. But let's get into the reason that you're all here. You're all hungry for some footage comparisons, aren't you? Well then, let's dive in to some gameplay. On the mClassic website, the vast majority of the footage comparisons they use are coming from Nintendo Switch games, which makes me assume that this has been made with that particular system as its primary focus. For that reason, I think it makes sense to start there and show you some comparisons between the mClassic footage and some raw unaltered footage, all being recorded by an AverMedia Live Gamer 4K capture card and through OBS Studio as the capture software. To begin with, I'm keeping things simple and setting the Switch to output at 1080p, which is its maximum resolution. So here's some gameplay of Super Mario Odyssey from the console with no upscaling, and here is the mClassic enhanced footage. This is actually a pretty dramatic difference and an amazing first impression. Let's look at some side-by-side footage because I think that showcases the difference a lot better. So on the left we have the Nintendo Switch video in its raw form, and on the right is the mClassic footage. Mario looks a lot sharper on the right, whereas on the left he almost looks slightly out of focus. The colours appear to be slightly more vibrant from the mClassic too, and if we zoom in a little little bit, we can pick up on even more minor differences. The anti-aliasing effect of the mClassic is clearly making things look less jagged. Just look at the billboard and the staircase on the side of this building and you can see that the difference is pretty big. Then look at the peak of Mario's cap here and you can tell it's far smoother on the mClassic than on the Switch itself. Moving over to some gameplay with more motion and you can still see a huge difference. It's like there's more contrast and saturation from the mClassic and the sharper image allows you to pick up on more detail in the environment. I mean, just look at this sand. I'd love to be running along a beach like that right now, but instead let's move on to the next game to look at some more crispy pixels. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is already a gorgeous looking game. Probably to this day it still has the best graphics I've seen in a Switch game, so what can the mClassic do here? Well, I will admit, the difference here isn't actually all that noticeable. If you really look closely, you can tell that the mClassic image is a bit more vibrant, but the difference with this particular game is negligible. An interesting thing I noticed is that on the loading screen, the mClassic actually blows the image out to such an extent that you can't see the pattern in the background. Whereas if we swap to the raw image, this is what it's supposed to look like. So, wait a minute, why is it that we're getting such dramatically different results depending on the game that we're playing? Well, I think this has something to do with how the mClassic handles different resolutions. When in docked mode, Super Mario Odyssey has a dynamic resolution which can change from 1600 by 900 all the way down to 1280 by 720, but it sits mostly around the 1440 by 810 area. I know I'm spouting a load of numbers at you here, but just stay with me for a second. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, meanwhile, has a consistent resolution of 1080p when docked, which means that the mClassic isn't upscaling the image at all. This is probably why the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe footage looks much less impressive than the Super Mario Odyssey footage. Now, where things get a little bit more complicated is that the mClassic is technically capable of upscaling beyond 1080p. It can output a 1440p and even 4K signal, but these come with a few massive caveats. Firstly, the 4K signal is locked to 30 frames per second, which decreases its usefulness considering that most games will be targeting 60 frames a second nowadays. Secondly, the 1440p signal doesn't work unless the display you're using supports a 2160 by 1440 resolution specifically. Even if your display supports 4K, if it doesn't support 1440p, the mClassic won't output that higher resolution. One solution to this is to purchase an additional device which can trick your display into receiving and displaying a 1440p signal, like this cheap HDMI adapter I found on AliExpress. A link to that will be in the description if you're interested in checking it out. But for the purposes of this video, I'm sticking to using the mClassic as it is, with no extra devices attached, as that's probably the experience most people are gonna have with it. But this got me wondering, what would happen if we took the Switch and made it display a 720p signal and then upscaled that to 1080p using the mClassic? Could this be better than the Switch's default 1080p? Well, first, let's look at the raw 720p video coming from the Switch, and then swap over to the 720p mClassic upscaled footage. The difference here is night and day, which is great because it proves that the mClassic is in fact upgrading the image fairly significantly. But now, let's get rid of the raw 720p footage and replace it with the raw 1080p footage. Now this is where it gets interesting. I would say that the 720p mClassic footage here is actually better than the raw 1080p footage. This implies that the mClassic prefers a lower resolution signal to then clean it up and rescale it to 1080p rather than taking a pure 1080p signal which it can't do as much with. Basically, unless you have a display which is capable of accepting a 1440p resolution, the mClassic can only show what it's capable of with a 720p or lower resolution. This is perfect for the Switch because a lot of games games don't run in 1080p. So let's have a look at one more game with The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So this game runs at a resolution of 1600 by 900, meaning that the mClassic will take that and upscale it to 1080p. So for this test, I think it makes sense to leave the Switch itself at a resolution of 1080p, seeing as the native resolution of the game sits between 720p and 1080p. And we don't really need the mClassic to be upscaling from a lower resolution than what's necessary. So here's the game running normally in its raw form with no upscaling, and here it is running with the mClassic upscaling. Again, this is a pretty major upgrade. Link looks so much more in focus here, and even the background elements have so much more clarity. Obviously, there is a chance that you're looking at this and you're thinking, sure, I can see a slight difference, but it's so minimal that it doesn't really matter, and yeah, I definitely get where you're coming from. Let's face it, the mClassic isn't a miracle worker. It's not going to make Switch games look like they've been ported to the PS5. This is a product aimed at enthusiasts who want the absolute best picture quality they possibly can get, and for that type of person, I think this could be a product worth investing in. But before I go in too heavy with the recommendation, I do want to do a few more tests from other consoles, because you might want to use this with more than just the Switch. In theory, the PS3 and Xbox 360 would be prime candidates for the mClassic. Both of them use HDMI as their primary video output, and both of them mostly feature games that run at 720p. And while the mClassic doesn't specifically state it works with these consoles, I'm still interested to take a look. Starting with the PS3, let's take a look at Red Dead Redemption. I'm actually not all that impressed with the quality we're getting here, and it's not really down to the actual upscaling, but the fact that the mClassic is making things too dark. This isn't too noticeable in the outdoor areas, but if I go inside, the mClassic makes this so dark that it's taken away from the experience, and you'd be better off playing without it. Weirdly though, throughout my testing of the PS3 with other games, I never encountered this darkness issue to this extent ever again. This could be a very contextual issue which has something to do with Red Dead Redemption specifically, but it is definitely something to consider if you were planning on using this with the PS3. I also tested Dead Space, where once again the image produced by the mClassic was darker than usual, but it wasn't too dark, and if anything, it actually made the game look more moody and atmospheric. In terms of the upscaling, the mClassic was making things look a bit crisper. When I zoom into background details, you can tell that they're a lot clearer and less jagged too. So after having one game which was successful and one which was unsuccessful, I decided to move over to a third game with Little Big Planet, and this is where the mClassic started to work its magic. The image produced by the mClassic here is fairly obviously better. You can make out more detail in the textures, things in the distance look more clear, and everything just pops a little bit more. Journey was yet another game which I would probably say looked better with the mClassic. It is subtle here, but it does look a bit sharper, and it almost looks a little bit more dynamic, with the colours being slightly more vibrant. It's particularly noticeable here on these broken slabs on the floor, but also when we zoom into these columns, it's a bit less jagged coming from the mClassic. So it seems that the improvements you're gonna get from the PS3 will be fairly inconsistent. Some games are negatively affected by the way the mClassic handles colours and brightness, and then other games actually end up greatly benefiting from it. So while it's a bit hit and miss here, it might be worth trying it out on a game-by-game basis. The Xbox 360 is obviously very similar to the PS3 graphically, so I went into this with reasonably high expectations. However, every game I tested here didn't really look any different. I tried Rayman Legends, which literally looked identical with or without the mClassic, although to be fair, this game does run at 1080p even on the Xbox 360, so that could be why it's not doing very much. But then there's Halo Anniversary, which to me looks exactly the same in these footage comparisons. Dead Rising maybe looks ever so slightly darker through the mClassic, but as far as I can tell, it looks exactly the same quality-wise. And then I did one last test with Halo 3 ODST, and again, surprise surprise, it looked almost identical. Maybe this is just me. If you're looking at the footage and you can tell a difference, then definitely let me know. But for me, the difference the mClassic makes to the Xbox 360 is so minimal that it's just not worth it for this console. I actually have no idea why this is either. Maybe maybe it's something to do with the way the Xbox 360 handles its graphics. Maybe a lot of these games are natively applying some post-processing effects to make them look better. I don't know, if anybody's got any ideas about this, let me know in the comments. But I know what you're all asking. You want to know about everybody's favourite Nintendo system, the Wii U. Well, you're in luck, because I'm one of the few maniacs who still owns that console, so let's give it a quick test. So first I wanted to look at The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD, because not only is it one of the best looking Wii U games, but it's also one of the few Wii U games that hasn't been ported to the Switch. As you can see though, there's practically no difference, and yes, the reason for this is that once again it runs in 1080p. I honestly thought that Wind Waker HD ran at 720p for some reason, but apparently I've been misinformed. Maybe that's why it still looks so damn good. So let's ignore that and move on to a game which runs at 720p with the original Splatoon. Once again, the mClassic shows what it's capable of with a 720p signal, because here you can see some level of improvement. It looks a bit sharper overall with the mClassic, and if we zoom into my Inkling's glorious hairline, we can see that the Wii U's video output is much more jagged than the mClassic output. Once again, it isn't a huge difference, but it definitely looks better. So I'm guessing that for any other 720p Wii U games, the mClassic could very well come in handy. But we aren't quite done here yet. We're a retro-focused channel, and I feel like I wouldn't have done my duty unless I at least tried to use the mClassic with some of these retro consoles. So how can you expect it to perform in this area? The effect you get from older systems is going to vary dramatically based on what console you're using. I tested it with PS1 and PS2 games, and there's literally no difference in the majority of games. Here's a side-by-side of Ape Escape on the PS1 as an example, and here's Grand Theft Auto San Andreas on the PS2. However, if we move over to the Dreamcast, there's actually a fairly big difference. The mClassic is pretty dramatically improving the image in terms of sharpness and contrast, and it's doing a great job at cleaning up the jagged edges. I think the reason that the mClassic is improving the Dreamcast so dramatically while not having an effect on the PS2 at all is down to the mClassic not supporting 480i signals, which is what the PS2 typically outputs. It will display the image, but it won't be applying any of its upscaling or additional features, basically acting as a pass-through even in its processing on mode. The Dreamcast meanwhile is capable of 480p output, which does work with the mClassic, so in most instances I wouldn't recommend the mClassic for PS2. There are certain games which do output 480p, but a massive majority of the games were incapable of this. It's also worth pointing out that you could theoretically use something like the RetroTink 5X Pro to convert the PS2's 480i signal into a progressive scan, which would make it compatible with the mClassic. However, this is sort of beyond the scope of this video. I just want to stick to what you would realistically be able to achieve with a standard setup and the mClassic on its own. The bottom line here is that any console that outputs an interlaced signal, which is typically any console released prior to the Dreamcast, won't be affected by the mClassic without the use of an additional device. Whereas any console that outputs a progressive signal, which is typically anything released after the Dreamcast, will be affected by the mClassic and will typically look much better with it. Now I know I just said a minute ago that I wanted to focus on talking about the mClassic with no additional devices, but you might be wondering how I'm actually using the mClassic with these older systems, considering that they don't use HDMI cables. So the way I'm displaying the image from the Dreamcast is through a Kaiko Dreamcast HDMI adapter, which is then plugged into the mClassic, and the way I recorded the PS1 and PS2 games was through component cables plugged into a RetroTink 2X and then going into the mClassic. But really, all of this faffing around with other upscalers and adapters to convert retro video signals into HDMI kinda defeats the purpose of the mClassic. It's supposed to be an easy, simple plug-and-play device that works on its own, so really I don't think it's well suited to any console that doesn't natively output progressive video. If you're looking for an upscaler for those older consoles, you're probably better off getting a device which is specifically aimed at them, rather rather than the mClassic, which is clearly more suited to systems which output video through HDMI. And don't get me wrong, you can make it work, but the amount of additional devices you'd need to buy to create this massive daisy chain of adapters and upscalers probably isn't worth it when you could just get a single good quality retro upscaler instead. So, would I recommend the mClassic? Well, I would, but I would say it's a bit of a niche product aimed at absolute perfectionists who want as much control over their HDMI signal as they can possibly get. If you're a person that's not all too bothered about that and you think that PS3, Dreamcast and Switch games already look perfectly fine, then this probably isn't for you. But when the mClassic works, it really works. It's just unfortunate that there's many different caveats that come with this particular device, which limit how you can use it. If you have a monitor or TV which supports a 1440p video signal, then it's highly likely that you'll see even more of a dramatic difference in quality than what I showcased in this video. For 4K upscaling though, I would look elsewhere because this is severely limited by only offering 30 frames per second in 4K. However, if you play a lot of games in 720p, especially on the Switch, which is where the mClassic seems to shine, this does legitimately make a difference. Going back to those Super Mario Odyssey clips, the difference in quality is night and day. So if you're wanting to revisit any games which run at 720p, or maybe have some crazy dynamic resolutions, then this could be a great investment. But that wraps up my thoughts on the mClassic. Let me know if this is a device that interests you, and let me know which of the games featured in this video were improved by the mClassic the most. And hey, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to see more retro content coming very soon, remember to check out our handheld history which is now available on Amazon, and I've been Rob from Retro Dodo, and I'll see you in the next one.